Alright, we're going to look at the major molecules of cells. And that's basically what chapter 3 is. They're these organic macromolecules. And how they relate to things is, let's kind of look at an example. So most of the world's population can't digest milk-based foods. That includes me. That includes your teacher. So these people are lactose intolerant because they lack the enzyme lactase. This illustrates the importance of biological molecules because lactase, like lactase in our daily functions. The enzyme lactase is going to be a protein, and this is actually a carbohydrate. So this is 2 of our 4 molecules that we're going to talk about. So first thing, before we get started, we have to talk about an intro to organic compounds in general. So we'll have to start here. Then we'll be able to talk about carbohydrates today and lipids very quickly. So we'll talk about these 2 and give some basic ideas. In the next lecture, we'll cover proteins and nucleic acids, and that will finish off this unit. Okay, so we need some essential questions here. Basically, one essential question today is, what are macromolecules? Okay. And what are their major components? Because they're all made of certain things. Components. Hello. Okay, so they're all made of repeating units, and we want to know what those units are. So we'll build a table a little bit later, but we'll get the gist here. So the first thing that we have to start with is an introduction to organic compounds. We have to know what organic means. Because organic doesn't mean the same thing that it means like in the store when you go shopping and you say, oh, I want an organic apple. That's not what we're referring to here. So in chemistry, organic refers to carbon-based molecules, and that's it. So almost all the molecules of a cell are composed of carbon. And it's a carbon bonded to other carbons and all kinds of other elements, but it basically has carbon. So this is a key point here, is that carbon-based molecules are called organic compounds. That's it. So if it's organic, it contains carbon, and that's it. That's the only thing. And so technically, everything that you find in the store is organic, but the organic stuff in agriculture is a different beast. Doesn't mean the same thing. So by sharing electrons, carbon can bond to up to 4 other atoms. It's like one of those connector sets. It can be a carbon, it can bond this way, or this way, or this way, or this way. So it can have up to 4 extra bonds, and those can branch in all kinds of directions. The simplest one is methane, because it's just got a hydrogen on each end. So it kind of finishes off there. That's our methane. Boop. But 4 covalent bonds, and remember those are sharing bonds, will link the 4 hydrogen atoms to the carbon, and each of the 4 lines in the formula for methane represent a pair of shared electrons. So you can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Carbon now has 8, it's happy, it's stable. Alright? But actually, just to show you here in the ball and stick model, if you look at it in the 3D model, it actually sort of looks like a pyramid, and the reason why, just for your general information, not something you have to learn, but the reason it does that is because each hydrogen are trying to get as far away from each other as possible, and that is the maximum distance between each one of them that they can get. That's as far apart as they can get. Just a fun fact. Here's something we do need to know, because this is going to come up particularly in this lesson, is that methane and other compounds composed only of carbon and hydrogen are called hydrocarbons. This will be particularly important for the lipids section, or the fats. Okay? Lipid fat section. Fats are made of hydrocarbons, so we'll talk about those. And it's a simple word, it just means hydrogen and carbons. It's tricky. So carbon with attached hydrogens can form chains in all kinds of crazy lengths. A carbon skeleton is what we would call it, is a chain of carbon atoms that can differ in length and be straight, branched, or arranged in rings. So carbon can form these little connections, and so it can be in a straight line with, you have to imagine, hydrogens all in these other places, but it can also branch out, so we could get a carbon here and a carbon here, and so now I've got a branch. Or they can even do these fancy things with rings. It's a true story. They'll make little rings. Boop. And then there'll be hydrogens that fill in all the rest. Boop. But yeah, that's the way they can do it. And the much better pictures of these things are like, here's ethane and propane. We can also double bond in the middle, and it gives it some different names if you want to go into organic chemistry. So there's a branching, we call it isobutane, and these are the rings. So they'll have little carbons all in a ring and hydrogens that fill it in. Sometimes they can have double bonds in between, like a benzene ring. Just side note is anything with a ring usually smells sweet. We get aromatics that way, they smell nice. So compounds with the same formula but different structural arrangements, because that can happen. And we mean like this one won't, like CH4, but you could have like C2, I think H6. And you can actually do it, maybe not that one, but you could do them a couple of ways, is the whole point. Okay, but if you could do it some different ways, then we call them isomers. And trust me, even though they have the same components, if they're arranged slightly differently, it can affect the entire molecule. So there's a couple of things, and this is a little video I can show you guys later. There's structural isomers, where they have the same number of carbons and hydrogens, but they're arranged differently, and these are just vastly different molecules. You can have these geometric isomers, where they look slightly different. Okay, you can see like there's some other group that's attached to either end. And then enantiomers are like mirror images. And we won't have to get into those, but trust me, they can have a huge effect on what happens. I'll give you an example of one a little bit later, but spearmint and like the caraway seeds that make up Italian sausage, that kind of real Italian-y taste, those are actually isomers. They're enantiomers. So we'll talk about that. The unique properties of an organic compound depend on the size, the shape, and the carbon skeleton. Okay, how about carbon skeleton? The groups of atoms that are attached to that skeleton. And the groups have a special name. We'll call those things functional groups, but really the properties come from size, shape, and group of atoms. So that would be a key point. Okay, so if you look at these, testosterone is the major, the major hormone for males, and the major female hormone as far as reproductive stuff is concerned is estradiol or estrogen. And if you notice, these guys all have these ring structures that are basically the same, but it's the difference in two functional groups that affect the way they affect your body. And they affect your body very, very differently. Okay? So we have what are called functional groups, because they affect a molecule's function. Okay? We won't go into it, but there are 6 groups total. The first 5 are hydrophilic. You don't really need to know that, but the major part is that we have functional group which affect a molecule's function. Yeah, we'll skip that part. But these are some examples. So a hydroxyl group there usually makes something an alcohol or some related to an alcohol. There's this C double bond O, which is a carbonyl group. You get a C double OH. That's a carboxyl group. We'll see that later with amino acids. There's an amino group, which we'll see in amino acids. There's a phosphate group that we'll look at later when we talk about in the future ATP and that kind of thing. And then methyl groups are just other little groups that just hang out in there. A pretty easy little group there. So you really don't have to know all these. It's interesting to look at and they help you identify things, but they're not necessarily things that you have to know right now. You can take a look at them if you're interested in kind of organic chemistry type things or just chemistry in general, but the rest of us are fine to move forward. These are the big things though, because we're going to discuss these in more detail over the next couple of lectures. So there are 4 classes of molecules that are important to organisms. That's a big one. We have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Okay? Those are our big 4 guys that we're going to talk about. Alright? And today we'll cover the first 2. Yep. Today. Alright? So now's a good time at the 10-minute mark. Take your break, pause the video, go walk around, make your brain work a little bit. The 4 classes of biological molecules contain very large molecules. Why are they called very large? Well, how do we call very large anyways? Is macro. So macro means big. So these are essentially big molecules. And they're very large molecules because they're large. Compared to other molecules, they're huge. And they just take up a lot of space. They don't get in and out of the cell very well. They're just big molecules. We also call them polymers because they're made from identical or similar building blocks strung together. Right? So we call them a polymer. You might have heard that word before in a different context, but for polymers we just have repeating units, so it's going to be made of many. Okay? And the building blocks that we have for polymers are called monomers. So all of these are good important definitions to know. So monomers. And I always say it this way, is what makes up a polymer? A monomer. So mono means one, so a one-mer makes up many mers. It's silly, but that's how I remember it. A one-mer makes up a many-mer. Alright, how are they strung together? So they have to be attached. It's kind of like attaching parts to the connector set. Things have to fit. Well, in order to do that, in order to link them together, we have to use what's called a dehydration reaction. And what happens when you're dehydrated? You don't have enough water, or you're losing water. So that's what happens here, is we remove or lose the water. So we lose a water. We lose an H2O. Boop. Alright, so polymers are broken apart by hydrolysis, which lysis is a word we'll see later, but it means to split. And so this is trying to say, with hydro, we're trying to split a water. Kind of. Okay. Which kind of takes in water, and then we're going to split it apart into 2 different sections. So we lose a whole water here, and then here we kind of bring it back in and then split it. So addition of water to break it apart. It's pretty crazy. This actually takes enzymes because, water is a pretty happy little molecule and doesn't want to break apart all that easily, and things don't like to move around as easily as we'd like. So we do have specialized enzymes which speed up the rate of those reactions. And we'll talk more specifically about how those work when we get to proteins, because enzymes are proteins. But enzymes will help speed that process up. So a cell makes a large number of polymers from a small group of monomers, and that's kind of a key thing that we'll talk about. Is like proteins that we'll look at later, they only have 20 different amino acids. And this actually makes up your entire body. So there's proteins everywhere, and every one of them is a little different. Right? And it's only 20 different repeating units. DNA, and we've already talked about this last week, is that DNA is built from just 4 kinds of monomers. Just those 4 things, those A, T, C's, and G's. Those 4 things. And if we have 50% difference between us and a banana, that's how vastly different us and a banana look. Right? So all of that variety is based on not very many monomers. Okay? So the monomer used to make polymers are essentially universal. And that's a key point. Everybody, like the plants, animals, fungi, even little bacteria, really all use the same kinds of building blocks. We just all use them a little bit differently. Okay? So to show you dehydration synthesis is here's a polymer, we're going to add something onto it. In order to add to it, we'll take one unit, add it to the other, and you notice there's two H's and an O. They'll come together, we'll lose the water, it links it together. Whenever we want to break it apart, a water will then have to come into it. So it'll have to come in about here, and then we'll split the water up so an OH will go on one side and a hydrogen will go on the other. Okay? Based on the rest of the chemistry of that particular molecule. But this is dehydration, just so you're aware, and this is hydrolysis. Hydrolysis, so water splitting. So we're going to add the water and then split it. Okay? Carbohydrates. So we've passed the introduction now and we can talk a little bit about carbohydrates. This one's a delicious one. And we know that. Carbohydrates range from small sugar molecules to big, big things that we call polysaccharides. Okay, so sugar monomers are called monosaccharides, and we need to know that. Though I promise you, if you look on that root word sheet, you should find that saccharide, this section right here, means sugar. And mono means one. So a sugar monomer is a one sugar. And that's special. I tell you, if you figure out the patterns in these root words, the words will tell you what they mean. They want to tell you. They don't want you to guess. They want you to know. Okay, so a couple of monosaccharides or one sugars are fructose, glucose, and even honey. Delicious, delicious honey. From one of my favorite animals on the planet, the honeybee. Oh my goodness, I could tell you so much about the honeybee. They're so cute, and they have little dances, and they communicate through wiggling. I'm not even making that up. Okay, off the side notes, monosaccharides are our one sugars. Okay, can be hooked together by, again, a dehydration reaction, so we lose a water, to form more complex sugars, and then polysaccharides. So we take a one sugar, and we're going to make a many sugar. Okay, many sugar. The carbon skeleton of monosaccharides vary in length. Glucose and fructose are actually both 6 carbons. Yeah, that's pretty common for what we know of for like basic sugars that we talk about. There's others that are 3 to 7, but we're not going to visit those yet. Like you can visit those in a future course if you're crazy about science. Otherwise, let's just stick to our 6 carbon, mainly glucose. Glucose is fairly easy. Okay, so monosaccharides, again a one sugar, okay, are the main fuels for cellular work, and we'll get into that later on. These are used as raw materials to manufacture other organic molecules. These are the things that really we use for everything else. Okay, so this is what glucose looks like in a chain. That's not commonly how we find glucose, or fructose for that rather. How they actually look are in rings. Okay, and that was kind of that little like hexagon thing I showed you. Oh god, that was a terrible hexagon. My pen slipped. That was a not user error thing, I swear. No, that's how I'm going to fix it. There you go. So the ring diagram can include abbreviated, not showing any of the carbon atoms, or drawn with different thicknesses to indicate the ring is relatively flat and is attached extending above or below it. You really, honestly, I'm happy if you know a hexagon for the most part, because these things get really confusing really quickly, and this is more organic chemistry stuff. So if you get the basic idea of a hexagon, I'm happy. A hexagon is a ring in chemistry. Alright, so 2 monosaccharides, 2 one sugars, will come together to bond to form a disaccharide. Come on, you have to know that's a 2 sugar. You'd be sad if you don't know that one. Again, through dehydration reaction. A disaccharide sucrose, so sucrose is much closer to table sugar. what you would know of like as regular sugar. That's usually sucrose, and it's usually a glucose and fructose together in a partnership. So the disaccharide maltose is formed from 2-glucose. Okay? Those are just some examples, but make sure that you do know the words. If it's in bold, make sure you know that. Okay, so just to show you again, we want to make sure that we know that this is a dehydration synthesis. And if you didn't know, and I'm sorry I'm late on this one, but synthesis equals make. So it's a dehydration making reaction because we're going to dehydrate or lose a water and we're going to make something out of it. So that's why they're called dehydration synthesis. But here's maltose. We take the hydrogen and the oxygen together, we make a water, and they kind of live together there. Alright, little interesting connection here. Just worth knowing. You can jot down a few points, but it's really just an interesting fact here. So most sodas and fruit drinks contain high fructose corn syrup. There were all kinds of commercials on high fructose corn syrup several years ago and how it's, doesn't taste any different. That's up for debate. But fructose is sweeter than glucose. That's a true point though, as fructose is sweeter than that. But to make high fructose corn syrup, glucose atoms are rearranged to make the glucose isomer fructose. So high fructose corn syrup is actually used to sweeten all kinds of beverages. Look, I dare you, look at those peace teas and you tell me there's not high fructose corn syrup in your peace tea. I will be very surprised. Surprise me. Alright? But it consists of about 55% fructose and about 45% glucose. And it's a mixture that's about in the same proportions as sucrose. So they're trying to get to sucrose, but not. It's kind of faking a sucrose. But most scientific studies haven't really shown any consequences associated with replacing sucrose with high fructose corn syrup. I've heard that you can't tell the difference, but come on, like they use real cane sugar and Cokes from Mexico. And I'm sorry, but they taste different than Cokes from the U.S., which contain high fructose corn syrup. That's just my own personal opinion and my own anecdotal study. That's not real science, I suppose, but I'm just saying I taste the difference. You guys tell me. But although the consumption has declined somewhat in years of high fructose corn syrup, we do still have obesity on the rise, and that's something to consider. But good health is always promoted by diets, fats, vitamins, minerals, and carbohydrates, and exercise. So maybe you should lead a family activity where you guys go do walk and talk or something. Get your exercise in. Promote good health for your whole family. Alright? But we're going to talk about all these guys a little bit later as well. So these parts are major parts of good diet and appropriate nutrition. There you go. There's a Coke with high fructose corn syrup on it. Knew it. Okay. Polysaccharides, or the many sugars. So many sugars. You're going to know what saccharin is before this day is over, I swear. Alright, these are micromolecules and polymers composed of thousands of monosaccharides. You say, where can there be a sugar this big? I'll show it to you. So, polysaccharides really are mainly for storing molecules and for structural components. So, unlike their smaller counterparts, which are sweet and tasty and delicious, these guys are kind of not for that. So starch, an important part of like potatoes and things like that, that's a polysaccharide. It's composed of just glucose monomers, and it's used by plants for energy storage. Just so you know. These guys are actually kind of in long chains. I'll show you in just a second. Glycogen is again a polysaccharide and mini sugar. It's composed of again just glucose, but this is used by animals to store energy. Alright, and it actually branches. So that's how they look different. I'll show you in a second. Just make sure you have the examples. That's the high point. Cellulose, again used by plants, and we'll find these in cell walls, but we'll talk about this later with cells specifically. I don't think, no, he's kind of lots of weird branches. And then we have chitin, and that's chitin. Not anything else, it's chitin. This is a polysaccharide, again another mini sugar. This is actually used by insects and crustaceans like crabs and all kinds of other things to build their exoskeleton. We actually find it in the cell walls of fungi too. Who knew that fungi and insects and crustaceans could sort of be related? We will come across that later. Okay, so there's starch in a nice long line. It's just a chain of glucose stuck together. Glycogen's very similar, but animals use it and it's kind of more branchy. And then cellulose, again for plants, for the cell walls. Really straight lines, but sort of bound together. So it's very, very strong. Okay. Polysaccharides are usually hydrophilic, and that means they get along with water. They're water-loving. It's actually literally what that means. Hydro is water, philic means love. So an example here is kind of like with bath towels. These guys are usually made of cotton, which is basically cellulose, and so it absorbs, and so the water sticks to it and walks up it. Okay. Kind of like what we looked at before. There's that adhesion, cohesion working on there. Alright, the last section is lipids that we'll talk about today, and then we'll be finished. Lipids are a little bit of the weirdos of this whole category. Lipids are awesome, but these guys are also water insoluble. We know that fats don't get along with water, oil and water doesn't mix. These are those guys. So again, hydrophobic means water. Oh, I guess we wrote it out over here. Never mind, just kidding. Water fearing, phobia, fearing. So they get along with water. Okay, and these are important for long-term energy storage. Okay, that's what we have fat for. It's an important thing. Your body's always in survival mode. It's like, well, but what if we're starving? We better hold on to it. It's like, we won't starve, but we might. That's what your body thinks anyway. So we have fats and things like that to store long-term. They contain twice as much energy as a polysaccharide. Okay? So twice as much energy as a sugar. And they consist mainly of carbon and hydrogen, and that's about it. Okay? And again, these guys will be kind of non-polar covalent bonds. So they're not polar, they don't have charges. So non-polar, no charges. That's why they don't get along with water. Water likes charges. So lipids differ from carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids in that they're not really big molecules. So they're not all that big, and they're not built from monomers. So they're not quite the same, but that's okay. We're going to get the right idea. So lipids vary a great deal in structure and function. This is a true story, and we'll give you some of the examples here. So the three types that we need to know are fats, phospholipids, and steroids. Okay, those are the three major types. A fat's a large lipid that's made of two kinds of smaller molecules, just a glycerol and fatty acids. That's what makes up a fat. A fatty acid can link to a glycerol from, oh, you guessed it, a dehydration reaction. Okay, that's how it works. And a fat contains one glycerol linked to three fatty acid chains. So one glycerol, three fatty acids. And this is why we call them triglycerides, because it's three fatty acids on a glycerol. So we call it triglycerides. And what they look like, basically to give you the idea here, here's our glycerol. We'll have hydrogen and the hydroxide come together. We'll lose that water and they'll attach. And we have three fatty acids here. Form these long hydrocarbons, as it's just hydrogen, just carbon. These three hydrocarbon chains. Okay? And those are our fatty acids. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about saturated and unsaturated fats, as I'm sure you've heard the terms before, and as far as health is concerned. So let's make sure we know that. So some fatty acids contain one or more bonds, okay, or double bonds, excuse me, a double bond. Okay, and if it has one or more, it just has to have one, but any more than that, and it forms what we call an unsaturated fatty acid. So what they do is one fewer hydrogen atom on each carbon of the double bond And what really is the major thing here is that the double bond actually causes a kink or a bend in that carbon chain, and it prevents them from packing tightly together and solidifying at room temperature. So let me go back to this other picture over here just to give you an idea. If I had just straight lines, those would be saturated ones, and I could stack a whole bunch right next to each other, and that would form a solid. But see how this has a double bond, and it just kinks it a little bit. So it's hard to get another triglyceride to sit right here and pack in tightly. Okay? So that actually, when they can't pack together tightly, they don't solidify at room temperature. So this is kind of your, like a good example is olive oil. Okay? So this is an unsaturated fatty acid because it's liquid at room temperature. Fats with the maximum number of hydrogens are called saturated fatty acids or saturated fats. Okay? Just, there you go. These guys are also, by the way, solid at room temperature. Okay? Ta-da! I'm sorry, I didn't tell you guys to take a break earlier. I hope you did anyway. I try to stay on top of that, but it's fine. We're at 30 minutes. If you need to, pause the video. Even for the last couple of minutes, pause the video. Take a mental holiday. Then come back. It's alright. You can breathe. Okay? I hope, though, when you're doing the breaking stuff, you're at least looking back over your notes a little bit. That's my only request here. Alright, so unsaturated fats are referred to as oils, like olive oil, vegetable oil. Okay, I'd have to ask the chef, but he's not in here right now, so I can't ask him. So he could probably give you a whole list of crazy oils. Oh wait, I just thought I want truffle oil. Ooh, I got fancy. Alright, most animal fats, however, are saturated fats, and that includes butter. We think Polydine butter, delicious, delicious butter, and lard, and all your good southern cooking, what it's made of. Right? Those things are saturated fats and aren't supposed to be as healthy for you. But you can hydrogenate, which means add hydrogen to vegetable oils, and it adds hydrogen, so it converts them to saturated fat. Why would you do that? But it creates these other things which are called trans fats, which just aren't natural. We'd have to look at, there's a structure to it, and we won't get into that, but it creates a health risk. So the whole point is to kind of avoid trans fats because your body actually doesn't know what to do with those things. It's like, what is this? Is it poison? Because I don't know what it is. Which is what happens with your body. When it doesn't know what something is, it just labels it as poison. True story. You know? Well, oversimplified, but nonetheless. So the other category we have are phospholipids. These guys are the major components of cell membranes. We'll get to talk about these in plenty of detail in the coming sections. These guys are structurally similar to fats, but they're only going to have 2 fatty acids attached to a glycerol as opposed to 3. So that's how they're different. Okay? And what they'll look like is you'll have a glycerol but with a phosphate group. That's why they're called phospholipids. Ta-da! And so it'll have a phosphate group and those fatty acid kind of tails that are attached there. Okay? And these guys will form a really cool little layer here. We'll talk all about how they work, but their hydrophilic or water-loving heads will be towards the outside or the inside of the cell where there is water, and their hydrophobic water-fearing tails, these sections, will actually kind of hang out together. And so it'll make a nice bilayer. But it's, by the way, the phosphate group that makes it hydrophilic. Just a little side note there, which is a functional group. So phospholipids cluster into a bilayer, which is 2 layers of phospholipids. Just those same words here, hydrophilic heads are in contact with the water in the internal part of the cell, which is also basically water. And then we have hydrophobic tails, which cluster together in the center of the bilayer. Alright? Oh, we didn't you didn't need that picture. You could look at the other one. The last one are steroids, and I'm going to try to finish you up here in about the next minute. But we have steroids, and these are lipids in which the hydrocarbon skeleton contains 4 fused rings. So it's sort of like 4 hexagons, but not exactly. Cholesterol is actually a steroid, and it's a component of animal cell membranes, and it's the starting material for steroids, including sex hormones. Okay, so cholesterol is kind of an important thing. Too much cholesterol is a health risk, which we talk about. But this is the basic structure of that cholesterol for a steroid. Okay, here's a little connection here. There are anabolic steroids, what my friends and I who were athletes lovingly called roids. And those are synthetic variants of testosterone that are abused by some athletes with serious consequences because it'll cause crazy mood swings, depression, it'll mess up your liver because it's not like the right thing, cancer even, high cholesterol, and some crazy intense blood pressure. The point, kids, just roids are bad. Okay? There's my message for the day. So, take a look at your notes, double check it. If you have any question at all, feel free to shoot me an email and we'll work through it.